Ridley Scott's 1982 cult classic Blade Runner is possibly the most influential sci-fi film to date. With its iconic shots of Los Angeles in the futuristic 2019, filled to the brim with skyscrapers, overpopulation, beaming lights and technology, Blade Runner became the standard archetype for the later subgenre, Cyberpunk. Defined by the Merriam-Webster dictionary as science fiction dealing with future urban societies dominated by computer technology, Blade Runner not only conforms to these conventions but was the initial blueprint for cyberpunk on film. Its disciples include, but are not limited to, works such as The Matrix, Ex Machina, and Ghost in the Shell. When you become even faintly acquainted with cyberpunk and its presentation of a technologized future, you may pick up on how intrinsically linked it is to the image of East Asian cities, more specifically Tokyo. Taking Blade Runner for example, with its grandeur, architecture, intrusive advertising, even having neon lights in Japanese and scenes resembling that of downtown Tokyo, it doesn't take long to point out just how Asian-infused the cyberpunk genre is. This cultural influence, or rather appropriation, as we will later discuss, is a testimony to the concept of Techno-orientalism. Defined and explored in the book of the same name, Techno-orientalism is defined by writers David S. Rowe, Betsy Huang and Greta A. New as the phenomenon of imagining Asia and Asians in hyper-technological terms in cinematic and new media representations. In this video essay, I will focus on the deep-rooted and inherent connection between Techno-orientalism on film and its history of xenophobia and racial prejudice. Likewise, how the presentation of Asia has been weaponized to present a fallen, doomed future. Part 1. Historical context. The Orient. To wholly understand the cultural significance of Techno-orientalism and how it is relevant to society today, we must first establish its history. Techno-orientalism itself is a rather new concept, coined in the late 20th century. However, its root word, Orientalism, can be traced back to the 1800s, with European artists depicting their envision of a mythical Eastern world. During this time, Europe was infatuated with the idea of the other. Eastern cultures, customs, and people were all seen on one hand as exotic and exquisite, and on the other hand as barbarians from an inhumane land. You may be wondering why they did all this. Why did they imagine other cultures through their own lens? Well, Edward Said, upon researching this artistic era, recounts in his 1974 book that European culture gained in strength and identity by setting itself off the Orient, simply meaning that Europe justified their own identity by making racial others seem their binary opposite. Think of it as a foil technique. As Glowy Gong states, if the Orient was backwards, then Europe was progressive. If the Orient was a place that required conquering, then Europe was justified to conquer it. But the bigger question looms: why Asia? Fast forwarding to the 20th century, America's economy was struggling economically through a huge recession, whilst across the Pacific, Japan were experiencing their most significant economic boom, which would go down in history. This influx enabled Japanese technology to advance at an immense pace, earning them the title of the next economic powerhouse. This surgency of new foreign power is evident by the many Japanese companies infiltrating into Western life, such as Sony, Fujifilm, and Nintendo.
Whoa, nice graphics! I'd like to get my hands on that game.
You mean you haven't played it yet? We can play it on my Nintendo Entertainment System.
This sudden power left America bewildered at the thought, what if Asia were to conquer and dominate the West? What will our future look like in their hands? This caused a rise in anxiety and uneasiness towards Asian success, threatening to overpower the Western hegemony. So much so that it was envisioned creatively. Labelled as a future Western society colonized by Asia, Cyberpunk was born from Western fears about what the future would look like with Asia as the global dominant power. This thus justifies why Cyberpunk is used particularly to show dystopias, failed societies which have crumbled at the hands of the East, as opposed to the West which would have provided a utopia in contrast. This is why you may see many American-labelled cities in the sci-fi genre supposedly corrupted by Asian culture. This hybridity is evident in the envision of Los Angeles in Blade Runner.
3, 4. No, 4. 2, 2, 4. And noodles.
It is important to add that before Blade Runner, there was Neuromancer. The 1984 comic was the predominant arrowhead for Cyberpunk, establishing many key conventions that we still see today. Its creator, William Gibson, personally testifies to his clear intentions of incorporating Japan into Cyberpunk, stating that Japan is the global imagination's default setting for the future. Whether Gibson did this absent-mindedly or even subconsciously given the economic climate of the time, manipulating Asian customs to be associated with a catastrophic future can give the wrong message and is ignorant of the cultural values these assets hone. Although envisioning a future society that is racially inclusive, appropriating the aesthetics of Asia just further promotes the idea that foreign cultures are to be tokened for their looks rather than their cultural value. As Amelia Precup states in her essay, All Cyborgs Are Asian, there is a trend in speculative fiction that explores the negotiation between technological progress and ethno-racial categories. Race and ethnicity have begun to shape specific ways of imagining the future, thus leading to the emergence of racially determined aesthetics. Techno-orientalism has simply contributed to the notion that an Asian future is equivalent to a dystopian society. This is anchored in film aesthetics through the impersonal Asian landscapes that evoke ideas of capitalism and control, or in other words, the antithesis of the American dream. Techno-orientalism maintains the same status quo that we saw in the 1800s of progressive West versus failed East. This dichotomy being prevalent centuries on shows how inherent and systemic Asian xenophobia remains in our societal infrastructure, so much so that it trickles into our creative industries.
The rising violence against Asian Americans needs to stop.
Part 2. Asian Characterization. The Cyborg. All of the sci-fi products that I have mentioned have two things in common: an Asian imagined city of the future and a lack of actual Asian characters within these places. As Angelica Jade Bastien puts in her article for Vulture titled, "Why Don't Dystopias Know How to Talk About Race?" she clearly explains that science fiction has long had an uncomfortable relationship with Asian cultures, which are mined to create visual splendor in order to communicate otherness. Race is relegated to inspiration, coloring the towering cityscapes of these worlds, while the white characters toil under the hardships that brown and black people experience acutely in real life. Interestingly, there are many allegories to colonialism when imagining a dystopia on film, hence the lack of cultural boundaries. The white protagonist, however, is reimagined to be the victim of this futuristic oppression, struggling and overcoming these hardships. As Bastien alludes, they are both the victim and hero that single-handedly dismantles this corrupted system, suggesting that minority groups in reality are just not trying hard enough to combat their marginalization. On the other hand, however, Asian characters are presented to be subhuman, or rather a cyborg. The 2017 Ghost in the Shell remake of the classic 80s anime received predominantly negative criticism over their casting of Scarlett Johansson to play lead Japanese character Major, thus being a clear example of contemporary yellowface, i.e. someone non-Asian impersonating an Asian character.
One murder, too many suspects. Too many people have motive.
The producers casted Japanese actress Rila Fukushima to challenge this backlash. However, her character was masked as an assassinating robot, cold, unfeeling, and non-human. Her very racial identity has been erased and replaced. Morley and Robbins explore this idea of technologizing Asian bodies in their book Space of Identity, stating that the political and cultural unconscious of the West imagines Japan as the figure of empty and dehumanized power. Japanese people are seen as unfeeling aliens, cyborgs, better adapted to survive in the future. The fear of Asian uprising and success is prevalent throughout history, with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 being a prime example. The era of the Yellow Peril proved to be a time of moral panic in America over the influx of Chinese immigrants seemingly infiltrating manual labour workspaces such as mining. The act essentially legalised the discrimination of Asian bodies, preventing them from obtaining citizenship and demonising their presence. Asian workers were valued for their labour, but not granted the same human rights as their white counterpart. They were seen as mechanized beings, expected to work at a superhuman rate whilst being treated as less than human. Chloe Gong states that Asians were constructed in the Western mind as expendable technology in an effort to preserve Western righteousness for their laws and exclusion acts. The idea of expendable technology evolved, it did not go away, and this evolution reached the screens. Asian bodies are continually sexualized, objectified, and most of all are demonized if they even attempt to act out of their subjugation. Conclusively, the misrepresentation of Asians and Asian culture can be identified in many sci-fi films, particularly within the cyberpunk subgenre. This perpetuation has encouraged, however majorly, the projection of xenophobic ideals onto a global scale audience. The dangers of its acceptance further goes to silence Asian voices and fuel harmful and racist ideologies, continuing the cycle of oppression and discrimination. Media's immediate and psychological effects on shaping one's outlook on the world should be considered thoroughly when examining racial tropes on film. It should be noted that the deconstruction of the xenophobic origins of Techno-orientalism is a mere single step in the direction of correcting, uplifting, and amplifying the voices of marginalized groups, especially people of color, in the film industry and wider media.
AWA, are you guys ready?
That's what I'm talking about.
Empower!